Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I'm Ashraf Engineer. What is home? What does it mean to belong to some place? And being forced to leave home and knowing that is permanent can leave emotional scars that persist down the generations. That is why the migration forced by partition continues to evoke such strong reactions and debates even today. It continues to shape politics in many ways and affect the national discourse. India hasn't treated all migrations equally, and what I mean by that is that while the two-way exodus on our western borders has been written about and found expression in popular culture, the migration on our eastern border, to and from what was then East Pakistan and is today Bangladesh, is not as well understood. Let's talk about that today.
All Indians matter.
We have on the show Rituparna Rana, who's completing a PhD in migration studies. She's an early stage researcher and a Marie Curie Fellow affiliated with Université Paul Valéry, Montpellier 3 in France, and Free Universitat Berlin in the MOVE's European Joint Directorate. Rituparna is working on the oral histories of second and third generation migrants from East Pakistan, what is today Bangladesh, during partition. She analyzes what home and a sense of belonging mean for this population and how they inherit the narratives of a traumatic forced migration from their previous generation. Rituparna, welcome.
Hello. It's really good to be here with you today.
Rituparna, much has been written about the migration on the western front of India when partition happened, but not as much is understood about the migration on the eastern front. Why is that?
So, when we conceptualize partition and when we say partition, of course, it happened on both the western frontiers and the eastern frontiers. But the reason why the eastern frontier is not focused upon, or why I chose to study it, is because even though we see it as a one collective partition experience, but the experiences were very different. One of the reason is because of the communal tension that already existed in the Bengal province. So this is when I'm starting from the 1905, when we had the British rule, and the country were divided in provinces rather than states. So in the Bengal province in 1905, this is very general history of the province, is when the first sort of Bengal partition happened, and it was annulled as well in 1911. But the concept that a province can be divided on the basis of religion was already, implanted in people's mind, and religious differences already came into existence. On the other hand, in 47, when partition was declared, for Punjab, it was, and when I say Punjab, I mean undivided Punjab, it was a very fresh sort of an experience. It didn't happen, they didn't experience division on the basis of religion prior to that. First, this was the reason. Second reason why the 1947 partition was very different when it comes to East Pakistan and West Pakistan is because West Pakistan had more commonality with the other Islamic lands of Southwest Asia, as it had with India. But this was not the case with the Eastern Pakistan. And what I mean by this is the Muslims residing in Bengal province had more similarity when it came to language, which is Bengali, clothing, food habits, lifestyle, as that of the Hindus living in the same province. But with the Punjab Muslim identity, they sort of resembled other Islamic nations from Southwest Asia. So when the only sort of symbol of division that sort of became uniform in both the western and eastern province was religion, it was more complex because religion is just one part of how we identify culturally. There are a lot more things that people relate to when you divide a population, or when you ask a population to choose whom they want to associate with. Also, similarly, Urvashi Butalia, who's a well-known oral historian, partition scholar, she talks about that how there's a very serious gap in the historiography of the 1947 partition and the omission of the experiences in Bengal and East Pakistan. So this entire section throughout history has been neglected in some sense. So there's always a little mention that this happened, but it's not always focused upon. And there's another reason for that. That is, Bengal again saw another huge war in the War of Liberation in 71, where East Pakistan became Bangladesh, the independent country that they are today. So it's like a three histories of partition that Bengal witnessed. And when we revisit partition, it's always the 71 war is what is talked about. When you talk about violence, when you talk about, people trying to find liberation, people trying to raise their voice about who they are, about an identity of what it means to be, a Muslim Bengali living in East Pakistan, it's always the 71 war that is focused upon. And this is also very evident in the kind of stories that I collect. So I collect stories from the first generation where, the age group is more than 85, and it's between 85 to 95. So these are very old people who have already sort of confused chronology of who they are and their personal history. So when I'm talking about the 47 partition, they often confuse it with the 71 experiences. I let them go on with the narratives, of course. You do not tell them what to say and what not to say. But because the narratives are so similar in nature, the violence is so similar in nature, there's always a confusion of what happened in 47. How can we say this stopped? So these are the after effects of 47 and they stopped here, and this is the effects of 71 and this stops here. So history is so fluid, especially personal histories are so fluid. It's very hard to say where does one stop and where do the next begin.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, I was in fact going to tell you that isn't it a fact that this when we talk about the Eastern Front, it's the 71 war that always comes to mind, rather than the partition itself. But sorry to have interrupted you. Please
No,
continue.
that's exactly what I wanted to. So these are the main fundamental three reasons why the Eastern partition is so different from the Western partition. Also, why the 47 narrative is always sort of, it gets, the 71 sort of comes on the foreground and the 47 gets pushed back. Because, for 47, you also have the Punjab people to refer to, the Punjab narratives to refer to. The 71 is more crucial when it comes to, as per the historiography, it becomes more crucial when it comes to the Eastern Front, not the 47 one. But that was equally important, and that is what led to the 71. So that is why I focus on sort of where did those narratives disappear, why aren't they studied, what sort of experiences do they talk about, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. Any other key differences between the two sets of migrations other than the ones that you've already mentioned?
So if you talk about the contemporary times, I think there is. So, and when I say migration now, what I'm talking about the patterns of migration, right? Like how did people move and what are the different time periods when they moved? So with the Western part migration, there is a sense of finality. It happened once, and there was a plus minus 5 years or 10 years, you say, and that is all that happened. There was no population of people that sort of trickle down from the borders anymore. But the Bengal migration is very, very fluid. And I say this in both physical terms as well as the patterns of migration, because the Bengal border is half water, half landmass. You have the Ganga Padma River in the middle. So it's more fluid in the sense that even today you have a hell lot of undocumented migrants coming in. And this is the entire politics of West Bengal that is, also coming into play, like the entire vote bank question of why are they allowing those people to come in, but then why not allowing them? That's another different, debate. But the migration never stopped from Bengal. It also, the beginning of migration is, you cannot date it to so and so time, because even when before partition, a lot of people from what is now Bangladesh used to come to Kolkata being a major city, to study, to settle down for work, and the families used to stay back in provinces that are currently in Bangladesh. And this was a very fluid come in, back and forth. They would go back, like what we do, in our holidays, we would go back to our hometown. They would similarly do that. So a lot of people, a lot of families, they share their narratives and they say that when the partition happened, half of our family was already in West Bengal. Like I'm talking about the Hindu families. They were already in West Bengal. They were working there. They had families there, but they had to migrate the rest of the half of the family, once the partition became a final sort of a judgment. So the fluidity is much more when it comes to the eastern border rather than the western border, and it's still true. Like a lot of our unorganized labor force, a lot of our domestic help, they are from, they are Bangladeshi migrants. They're still that exist,
Yeah,
both in
yeah.
Delhi and in West Bengal. There are a huge
And
population.
Mumbai also, I would say.
Yeah. So you do have them coming in even today. So I think it's easier to assimilate for them in some sense, being Bengali, because we talk the same language. Okay, the dialect is different, but we talk the same language. We have a sort of same sense of cultural identity, I can say. So it's easier for them. They don't look as, or they don't feel as outsiders. Of course, there are ways to differentiate if you want to differentiate and discriminate. That's a different concept, but they're just as Bengali as any West Bengal
Yeah,
person,
yeah,
So it's very fluid, even in the
yeah.
contemporary times.
And where did the migrants from the east settle? Were there specific pockets or any one place?
So, one of the good qualities, I would say, of the migrants that came from the 47 sort of partition were, so even though they had to sort of lose all land and property and money, and they could not really bring a lot with them, but they all were, mostly, they were good, educated. They had sort of job experiences. So that is something that they inherited. So when they came to India, they wanted to sort of stay in places which could offer them more jobs so that they could start their lives afresh. So West Bengal, of course, because, Bengali connection, became a place where they wanted to migrate, where they wanted to settle down. Also, it was more familiar geography for them, but also Delhi. Delhi was like a huge opportunity for them to settle down, because central government, of course, you also have the state government, and you did have jobs where you needed educated people, and they had the education. So it was comparatively easier sort of merging than settling down in any other place in India. So even today, the larger colonies that were settled back then for the refugees that you study about, the Bengali migrants, are in West Bengal and in Delhi.
There were, of course, the physical difficulties of the move, but what kind of lasting emotional impacts did you notice in the course of your research?
Even in this question, I would first even focus on the physical difficulties. So when I started interviewing people, I had a very different idea of what physical difficulties are. So, how to sort of travel, that could be one physical difficulty. Like, do you take a boat? Do you take a train? How do you reach there? Covering the distance. But there were other physical difficulties which I had no clue about. For example, during that time, because hundreds and hundreds of people were traveling, actually thousands of people were traveling, hygiene was a huge issue. So there were always an outbreak of cholera. And back then you didn't have medicines for cholera, or because you were in move, you didn't have proper treatment, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people did die of violence. Of course, we know those stories, and we know those histories. But there were other physical conditions that sort of affected families gravely, which are never sort of brought into the foreground to understand sort of the other physical constraints or hurdles that people had to pass through to reach where they wanted to reach. So even the physicality in itself is very diverse. It's not just the physical movement, and you had to figure out the logistic or the itinerary of the travel. It was way more than that. It was the entire physical well-being that was being affected. But apart from physical, yeah, of course, the emotional, the psychological traumas. So it differs from generation to generation. So the narratives that I collect are for first generation, of course, but the first generation back in 47, they were all children. I have stories of people who were like 5-year-old, 7-year-old, maximum a teenager, that too till 14 or 15. They were not very old. So they had their parents who actually sort of took care of the family, protected the family, gave security, a sense of safety. So they are talking about their parents' stories. So for a kid, the psychological trauma or the psychological condition is very different from an adult who traveled during partition. So, but I never could interview the adult, because of course they're the parents of this generation. They're no more there. But I find it very interesting how sort of when they talk about how as kids they experience the psychological trauma, it was very different, because as kids you cannot process too much of trauma together, or I don't even know whether I should call it trauma. You can't process loss or change or something that is so unusual. You don't know what is happening. Nobody's telling you, nobody's giving you a reason, because you're a kid, but you have to take this journey and you have to you're told that you have to start living in someplace new without given any prior explanation for it. Or even after they have settled, they have no idea why this happened. Right. So nobody is justifying things to them, nobody's explaining things to them. They just have to go with the flow in some sense. So it's very interesting how kids understand this idea. Also, violence. Like, I remember this one narrative which sort of stayed with me forever, where this woman, she's talking about, she was 7 year old, she had a sister who was 5 year old, and they were living in a Hindu colony after migration. And when I say Hindu colony, I mean majority of the people were Hindus there. And one fine night they saw a mob starting to burn houses and tents and refugee, those camps. And they were really scared. And she recalls this, that a few weeks earlier the Hindus had burnt a Muslim sort of colony, so now it was a payback time for them. But she was a very young kid and she did not understand what was happening. And she remembers that her mother sort of had this, so we have this huge knife sort of a thing, we call it boti, in which we cut vegetables and things like that. And she remembers her mother, holding it and telling her, both like her and her sister, that before the mob can touch you, I'll cut you both and then I'll cut myself, rather than let them come and violate you in any form. And she, even today, when she was like, when I said today, this was an interview perhaps 5 years back, and she was telling me with a weird smile in her face, as if it was amusing for her that something like that could have happened to her. So even as adults today, for them to process something that happened to them as kids is very difficult. It's very fragmented in their head. So even back at that time, she remembers telling her mother, Ma, why don't you wait for 2 minutes? Let the mob pass. If they come, then cut us. Otherwise, don't. A 5 year old, a 7 year old telling this to their mother without understanding what it means when her mother is saying this, how much fear and anxiety she's going through. I think even today, as an 85-year-old woman, she is unable to process it somehow, because she lived that experience. And then they started, the partition happened, and then they started living normally, whatever that is, whatever the new normal was. And then they had to focus on finding a new livelihood, settling their kids, putting them in schools, and so on and so forth. So the time to process those narratives actually never came. It never happened. So even today, when they tell those stories as going back to a 5 year old's voice, it's very fragmented, and it's very disturbing to some extent how people internalize these stories, and if
Yeah.
they ever do, really.
And how are these impacts passed down through the generations?
For this, I would like to go a little bit into the sort of theoretical concept that I study, to study how these impacts are passed down. This is a concept called post-memory, and this was a concept introduced by Marianne Hirsch, and she is a scholar who works on second and third generation Holocaust families. So she studies how traumas of the first generation affect the second and the third generation. So I sort of took up her idea of what post memory is, and she describes it as the relation of the generation after that bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before to an experience, as they remember only through the means of stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. So it's a very, you experience it secondhand, not first hand. So I use this concept of post memory to understand how sort of these impacts were passed down in generations, in second and third generation within the partition migrants. And to do that, I take like two different medium. First is orality, or how oral narratives is very crucial to sort of first, voicing out, even saying out orally, makes you realize that something did happen. It reaffirms it. Because for so long, people have been silenced. They did not think that their narratives were important enough, that they bear any sort of, importance in the sense of it affected how we understand nation and citizenship and our current country. So they never thought those little things, what they call as little things, actually mattered. So orality is a very essential and a very powerful tool to understand how narratives, or how impacts or experiences or traumas or loss or pain is transferred from one generation to the next. And secondly, I study how, concepts of remembering and forgetting is very important. So it's when a person is telling a story, what does the person choose to remember? Why does the person choose to remember that particular part? And what is the part that a person chooses to forget? And this also varies generationally, which is very interesting to see which generation remembers which part of the narrative, focuses on which part of the narrative, associates with which part of the narrative, and forgets which parts. So it's orality and forgetting and remembering is how I study, how it affects the generation after.
Yeah. And when you talk of second and third generations of the migrants, what is their perspective of partition? And you already touched upon that to some extent, of course. But how does that manifest itself in their attitude towards citizenship or Indianness?
So, with this question, I would first like to say that with the second generation, the narratives are very different, and with the third, it is very different. And what I mean by that is, so you have to understand the psyche of first, second, and third to understand what I'm talking about. So, when the first generation came in, their primary motive was to settle down and go back to normalcy, whatever normalcy was, whatever they conceptualized it as, which basically meant meeting basic amenities, right? You have a house, you have food, you have access to education, you have access to healthcare, and such, very fundamental things. So the process was more focused on settling rather than keep remembering or keep lamenting over the loss that they had faced. So their focus was the second generation to give their children a more normal setup than they could ever have. So for the second generation, when they tell their stories, and I sort of asked them whether they would be interested to tell me their stories, they said, we have no stories. This was a very straight answer from the second generation. And it took me a lot of effort to even understand why was this their most immediate response to these questions. It was because the first generation deliberately silenced their narratives, deliberately did not want these narratives to travel to the second generation, because they did not want them to feel that they were outsiders, that they lacked something, that they were not as affluent as the people who were already settled, as they were migrant. You have different names for this, like you have in Pakistan, you have muhajirs, that you are okay, you're Hindus, you're here, but you're never really from here, so you do not belong, you're like an in-between state.
Even in
Yeah,
Muslims in Pakistan, Muhajirs are
muhajir is a
Muslims.
very prominent term for both, for people who are in the in-between state, who will never belong to one particular
Yeah.
place, basically.
Right. And I read somewhere that one of the reasons why the first generation does not really transfer or talk about it so much also is subconsciously they understand that they're transferring trauma. And also of course the fact that they have to relive
Yes.
it themselves, which is by itself extremely
Yes.
tough.
So that is so for the second generation, when today I call them up and tell them, I'm studying second generation migrants, they get really annoyed with this terminology, because all through their lives, their parents and they have tried their best not to look, behave, act, or associate in any way to a term that is migrant, to an identity that is migrant, right? And now I call them up and tell them I'm studying second generation migrant, and they're like, who the hell are you to sort of tell us that this is the term that denotes us? And then I have to tell them that this is not something that I coined. This is something that academically is sort of a term that has been coined for families that came from first generation migrants. And then, you have to ease through the conversations and so on and so forth. But with the third generation, it is very, very different. Now, the first generation will not tell the stories to the second generation, but the first generation will tell the stories to the third generation. Why? Now, it's very interesting to study the sort of the psychology that goes behind the psyche that plays this entire game. So we have a tradition, all cultures have this tradition of grandparents telling stories, bedtime stories, lullabies, their nostalgic stories of growing up to their grandkids. The parents are generally working. The kids are always with the grandparents, mostly in a home setup. So, consciously or unconsciously, these narratives of growing up come into, in their narratives of who they are, where they're from, in the nostalgia of how they celebrated Durga Puja when it was pre-partition, of what kind of clothes they wore, what kind of games they played, what kinds of schools they went to, what were the literature that they were studying. So they were very toned down narratives. They were not very violent narratives that came forth, but those were the narratives that were passed to the third generation. This is the first reason. Second psychological reason why do first generation transfer narratives to the third generation is because they're now old people. They're going to die very soon. They are dying. A lot of my participants have already, they're dead in this meantime. So they feel a need, an urge to tell who they are before they cannot anymore. So it's a very human psychological tendency to at least, it's like passing on an heirloom, but passing on the narratives, rather to the next generation, but not with the second generation, because the second generation is also not interested to know. They're now working and they're busy sort of setting up the economy. But with the third generation, it's their grandkids and they have an access to their grandkids. So they want to tell the stories, and they are the people that the grandkids listen the stories from. So it's a both-way connection that the first generation transfers the narratives to the third generation. So it's very interesting how the second generation looks at these narratives and how the third generation looks at these narratives. So for the third generation, and especially in today's current India, where you have debates of who's an insider, who is an outsider, who's a migrant, how do you prove your origin, how do you prove that you belong from the country, how do you prove you are a true citizen, and things like that. It's also with social media being so accessible to the third generation, the current generation, social media being the platform to sort of have a global discussion about migration and migrants, which is a very, very sort of dynamic discussion going on everywhere in the world today about, inclusivity and diversity and so on and so forth. The third generation is very aware of these concepts, at least in a very nationalistic discourse, they are very aware of these concepts. So when today they come across these concepts in the news, in social media, they go back to their parents, which is the second generation. They ask them, we were migrants, your parents were migrants. Tell us about them. And the second generation do not have answers. They do not, because they themselves want to seclude themselves from the narratives, and their parents kept them in a bubble, which gave them a sense of security and normalcy. So there is sort of a lack in how the third generation cannot access these narratives anymore through the second generation, but rather directly from the first generation. So, it's going back to unsettling. So first, the process was to settle down the second generation, but the third generation is unsettling all these settled ideas of who you are and you belong, and, we are good citizens and we'll just do what is necessary. But they are more to unsettle these notions and ask more questions, start more debates, and they want to hold on to their heritage that, okay, we migrated too. Migration is something that requires revisiting, that requires to be remembered. We need to understand the things that we have lost in the process, that there was a political force in play that resulted in the 1947 partition, and we were the sufferers. So we don't have to shy away from those narratives anymore. So the perspective differs very much in sort of how they remember the stories now, or why do they want to remember the stories.
Yeah. And when it comes to the second and third generation, how do they view something like the Citizenship Amendment Act or the National Register of Citizens?
Yeah, so even, when I was interviewing my second generation, I used to give them sort of a tentative questionnaire and tentative topics that I was interested in knowing from them. And I would talk about, like, how do they relate to the current political scenario? Do they relate at all? Do they have any opinion coming from the background that they do? Not as, secluding that history. And I used to give them these questions, and they used to generally discuss it with their kids, which was very interesting. And they used to tell me about this entire process of discussing it with their kids. And the kids used to ask them that, Mama or Baba, do you know that the basis of this, CA and RC is the question of origin? Okay, it's based on religion, it's based on a minority, it's based on a lot of other things. But the question that comes down, the crux of it is origin. How do you prove your origin? How do you prove you belong somewhere? Right. It's as simple as that, but it's also as complex as that. How do you prove your loyalty of belongingness through papers? Or can papers prove that? Or do you have? So for the third generation, this was a very touchy issue. For them, it was like, we don't have a proof that we belong from India. If you sort of date back to where we came from, we were not from current India. We were from Bangladesh, current Bangladesh, and we have nothing to prove that now we truly belong here, except for what everybody has, your Aadhaar card or your PAN card or something like that. So how do you prove loyalty to where you belong? Like, okay, it's a question of religion now with the CA and RC, but if it wasn't, and the question still remains, where are you from? How do you prove your origin? How do you do that? So, these political debates, these political current scenarios affect very much the understanding of what we understand by migrants, what we understand by who belongs, what we understand by who's a citizen, what do we understand by how do you conform to a nationality, what is nationality, and all these questions, and which are very pertinent for the third generation. For them, a lot of my friends, a lot of people from the third generation whom I interviewed were there in the protests. They lived through it. They actually saw that happening. So it affected them in a very different manner than it affected the second generation. Because for the second generation, and they told me this, the second generation told me this, throughout our lifetime, because now they're all 60, 70 years old. So they're like, throughout our life, there was never ever a question where we had to rethink of who we are and where we are from. It was never like we never had to prove anything to say that we are Indians today. So it's now that our kids come and tell us and our kids come and question us that we have to rethink it, and it's very scary for them because they're in the middle. They saw their parents being scared of coming from one place where they didn't want to move, they didn't want to leave everything behind, and even though their parents tried their best not to convey these fears or pass on these traumas, it does exist. The silence is also a huge scream about the magnitude of that fear or that trauma. Just because the silence also talks about how troublesome or how fearful they are to talk about it. So the second generation did not want to associate with that because they knew the kind of fear that their parents were living in. And now they know the kind of unnerving things are happening politically that are again questioning back or pointing those silences and those fears. So for the second generation, they're very scared to sort of touch upon these issues and talk about it because they have been trained not to. They have been trained that's the safest way to live through it. But it's very different with the third generation. They want to question it, they want to challenge it, they want to know it. So it's very interesting how they perceive 1947 partition, how they perceive where they come from, how they perceive their stories.
Now, Rituparna, you grew up in the East Bengal displaced people's refugee colony in
Yes.
Delhi, which is known by something else, and you can talk about that. You would have heard stories of the migration. What is your personal position on the matter?
So I grew up in what we today know as Chittaranjan Park. It's called the mini Kolkata of Delhi.
Or
Very
CR Park,
Bengali.
as it's
CR
written.
Park, yeah. That version is CR Park. Very, very Bengali. So it was originally called as East Pakistan Displaced Colony, or called EPDP. Then it was East Bengal Displaced Colony, and then it became CR Park. So the thing was, in 1960s, around 1960s, the East Bengal refugees or East Pakistan refugees who came to Delhi, they asked the government, they sort of formed a group, asked the government that they need land. Because even in Delhi, these are the narratives that come from my interviews. These are not my sort of positions. So when I say that they said this, it is their narrative. So they told me that, they felt that there was a lot of provisions being done for the Western migrants, Western Punjab migrants, because they were more in number in Delhi. In northern belt altogether, northern belt of India, there were more in numbers. So also because Delhi itself is a more Hindi, Punjabi, always was more influenced towards this. So this is their narrative. So the sympathy, according to them, was always given to the Western migrants. So during the 60s, 50s, 60s, they started to sort of claim for a land for themselves. And in 66, around in 66, from 62 to 66, this area, Chittaranjan Park area, which was a very heavy, dense forest area back then, was given to them. They cleared it out, and then they settled here. And that for that they had to show a refugee migrant certificate. This is what they called me. I asked a lot of them about the actual name. None of them have it now, so they couldn't show it to me. But this is what they called it: a refugee migrant, East Pakistan refugee migrant certificate, which was given to them when they crossed India-East Pakistan border. And they had to show it to sort of claim land there. And the land was not given for free, but it wasn't very expensive. But for refugees, it was still a lot of money that they had to sort of pay for the land. But it was very subsidized and they got their land there. So this is the place where I grew up. After 71, the name was changed to East Bengal Displaced People, and it's currently Chittaranjan Park or Sia Park. So growing up there, and because the first generation were the ones who were actual owners of these houses and they all lived there and they did well. So when I told you earlier that they were really good in education and that was the only sort of wealth they carried with them, they were well settled in government positions, government offices, other businesses. They did pretty well. Like even today, Chittaranjan Park is one of the most posh areas in Delhi. So because they could do that, they settled their kids very well in good places and so on and so forth. So a lot of kids moved out. Today you will only find like single widowed grandfather or grandmother living there or the couple living there. Most of their kids are outside, and when I say outside, they're outside of India and they have their families outside of India. So it's a very old people's colony actually. So they were the only people you could talk to. You knew everybody's grandparents, like your neighboring households, you knew everybody. Also because you had your own grandparents. So even though I am not personally from a family who's from East Pakistan, the house in which I lived, my landlords, our landlords were such a family, and they used to tell me this. So I was very close to them, and they used to tell me their stories, and their friends used to tell me these stories. And in everything, every year in Durga Puja, they would tell me how their Durga Puja was celebrated, how it was done there. In food, they would tell how they put more spice or more chilies in it or whatever it is cooked. There's this entire, which is a very good thing today. The entire division is what we call Ghoti and Bangal. Bangal are people who migrated from East Pakistan, and Ghoti are West Bengal, always were from West Bengal Hindus. So they are Ghotis. The differentiation today is very cultural. It's like our food taste, when I say our and their, I mean Ghotis have more sweetness in their food, Bangal have more spice in their food, something like this. What's interesting is even today in West Bengal, the two football groups, West Bengal is a huge football crazy population, is Mohun Bagan and East Bengal. So even today in West Bengal, you have a group called East Bengal, which is for the Bengal, So it's a very different sort of an association. It's not so much as othering happening in a political sense. It's more cultural sense, but it's a very positive othering that happens. We don't really ask where are you from or whether you're a Ghoti or Bengal. It just comes up, Maybe some older generation will use some dialect that they are Bengal, or the food will someday be a special feast and something like that. But other than that, these were the narratives that I grew up with. These were the conversations that everybody had, because everybody in that colony shared a common history of migration, a common history of trauma. So all their references were always back to the 1947 partition or the 71 war, but it was always there. So it wasn't something that I sort of realized later on that, this is something that I need to study, but they were always in me. They were sort of embedded in also how I understand Bengaliness or being a Bengali or history of Bengaliness. It's also my understanding of who I am and where I am from and what sort of narratives did I grow up with. So yes, my position was, even though I'm not from those family, was very much a part of those narratives.
Yeah. And I think what's coming through is that the concept of home, of belonging, is such a primal, fundamental one. It never really leaves us, does
You
it?
cannot. It's not possible to not understand home or belonging when you try to understand who you are. Even when you're trying to understand it individualistically, or you're trying to understand it in respect to somebody else, when you're trying to use it as a relational term. For example, when I say home, now, when I say home personally in my research, it's a larger concept than where you live. So there's a physical home, of course, the house, the building made of bricks and cement and whatnot. And then there's a psychological home of where do you feel home? How do you say, it could be any place where you feel home. It not necessarily be the place where you grew up. It's good if it's that place, but today, when people are migrating all over the world, internal migration within India is such a huge phenomena. I think everybody has migrated at one point of in their time or the other. So I think there's a physical sense of what you consider your home. Where do you feel at home? Also, there's a third sort of layer to it. What is a social conception of home? So, when we talk about home, we talk about where I feel the most at home. But it's a two-way process. You feel at home, but others make you feel at home too, right? So it's not always how you feel, it's very much dependent upon how the people you're surrounded with make you feel, right? If they let you claim a place to be your home, if they do not, no matter how much you pay for a place, a plot, how creatively you build a home, you will never really socially feel at home, and therefore it will affect your psychological understanding of home. So there are different ideas. Also, the social one also talks about, and these are definitions that I'm coming up from the narratives that I've collected. These are not my definitions. So a person so this is a woman's narrative, and a husband had a transferable government job, and through her life she has gone to almost 15-20 different states in India. And I tell her, and she's also a partition migrant, second generation. It's a very interesting migration. So when I call her a migrant, she's like, yes, but I'm so many different kinds of migrant, what are you talking about? So so I could ask her, what do you understand by home? She's like, it's very simple for me. Where my husband is, where my kids are, it's home for me. So it's also the people that make you feel home. It's also the place that make you feel home. It's also what you understand how a home should be, how safe you feel, how content you feel, how at peace you feel, is also something that can constitute as home. So home is not one singular entity. It's an amalgamation of all of this. It's an amalgamation of how you perceive it, how the others perceive it, how others let you perceive it. So I think it's a dialogue in process. Even construction of home, it's a dialogue of physicality, your psychological state, your understanding and liking of the community that you live in. So I think it's very crucial, but it's also something that nobody can escape. Forget humans, I don't think any living organism can escape the idea of home in
Yeah,
some sense.
yeah,
You do belong to somewhere, well, you should, but that's the question, do you really? So I think it's very interesting to see it that way.
yeah. And speaking of people that make you feel that you're like home, or the environment in which you grow up, is the environment in which you grew up, the place in which you grew up, the people that you grew up with, did that impact or influence your choice of study and your area of research?
Yes, it did. So even in my sort of journey of growing up and understanding partition, there are three phases. First, me growing up with the narratives, where I did not know that they had an academic value, but I just liked stories. I was always sort of pulled in by the power of storytelling. The second, when academically sort of I realized that partition is a discourse. It's more than what we study in school textbooks and how we study it in school textbooks. You can study partition through literature, you can study it through history, through politics, through economics, various other things. So that was the second phase of my understanding partition. And third, when I myself got trained as an oral historian from this organization called 1947 Partition Archive, which is based in Berkeley, USA. And so it's an organization which has this was the first of its kind, and their entire aim was, because the first generation is dying out slowly, and before them we had no sort of repository where you could collect all those narratives. And these are primary material to study, right? These narratives are primary. They're not by some author, by some researcher. They are the stories in themselves. So they started collecting, like, all worldwide, because you have a lot of people settled in different parts of the world today who were once migrants, from the 47. So throughout the world, they have a huge network of volunteers and oral historians, and some of them collect stories, some of them archive them. So it's a huge body of people and primary material coming together, and it's very interesting. So I was trained with them. And so my third phase, when I actually entered the field, I moved out of books. I just refer to theories as theories, but I wanted to use those theories to understand the real life stories. So when I entered the field and I started, interacting the people and encountering the stories firsthand, it was a very different experience. So what you said, yes, my origins, they absolutely do matter. My interaction with these studies absolutely does matter. And it's just not from inspiration, it's also this training of me as an oral historian. I have witnessed how ignored these narratives have been. Like, in the sense of the ignored, they're told everywhere, people do share those narratives, but people don't hold them valuable. Even the people who tell the stories don't hold them valuable. They're like, we're just normal people, why are you so interested in knowing our stories? And that is the reaction people generally they have for their personal histories are, till now it is, and I'm very happy for it, but till a point in time they were not considered serious academic material. Also, these stories affect me in a very grave manner. To be absolutely honest, the trauma, the pain of these narratives do take a toll on my psyche, because some of these narratives, some of our interviews go on for 7 hours, 9 hours. Some of the first generation especially, they call me back to their house and they're like, we forgot to tell you something, and can we reschedule another sort of meeting? And I'm like, yes, please. And they're very long. So even the narratives of violence, it's very hard violence, and there are a lot of sexual violence. There are a lot of rape victims, rape survivors that I talk to, and they were very young rape survivors. So these narratives of trauma and pain, they do affect me. It's very hard to maintain a distance from them, and I personally feel that it's very inhuman to consider them just simply data for my study, and it's not doing justice to them. And I think a level of internalization and engagement is very necessary to understand how the experiences of partition are very different from the historical sort of historiography of partition that we have in the mainstream academics, and how partition is not one singular event. We need to, and there is I emphasis on the need, we need to study on the multiplicity that lies in these narratives. For every individual, the partition was different. For every individual, they experienced something different, and these narratives do haunt me. Like, this, some of the narratives still, it's very, very fresh in my mind, and it takes me some time to sort of readjust myself and to sort of, because as somebody who's an oral historian and collects the narratives, I have to be somewhere at a balanced position. I cannot be very emotional. I have to also take care that I'm able to control and comfort the participant. So I think a level of closeness is important, and I think the subjectivity also matters. I don't think it's very, the entire discourse about how objective should an interviewer be. I think the subjectivity matters because it also humbles me as a researcher of the kind of readings that I have gained through academics, but the kind of understanding of partition that I receive from these narratives, it's very humbling, and it's very, it brings you to perspective of how something is perceived versus how somebody who has experienced it tells about it. So I think it is a very integral part of who I am today and what I study today.
So, Rituparna, tell us about the South Asian Migrant Identity Narratives, Spaces and Constructs exhibition. Tell us also about the Virtual Migration Museum and how listeners can access it.
So this virtual migration museum project that I'm currently doing, it's called the South-Asian Migration Identity, Narrative Spaces and Constructs. It's a collaborative space where contemporary researchers, scholars, artists from South Asia, living in all parts of the world, are introducing their works using diverse mode of expression. It is a mixed media repository of academic, artistic, and other research material, and it is conceptualized in association with the State Library Berlin and the Institute of Advanced Studies, University of Minnesota. Also, the structure of the museum, as I said, it's a mixed media sort of platform. It contains a section where young authors and researchers, early stage researchers, and other sort of scholars who are writing on this discourse, there's a collection of their papers, of their research work. But along with that, there are exhibitions, online exhibitions. And this was comparatively easier for me to sort of bring together, to curate this, because with the COVID, a lot of artists, most of the artists, whether they were people worked with art installment or photography exhibition. They shifted everything online. There were a lot of exhibitions happening online during that period. So I'm trying to sort of also bring that. I'm not trying, it's happening. I'm bringing that within this platform, where you can see how different mediums such as photographs or art installations or music, sort of, or performances like theater performances, and artists who are working with migration, discourse of migration, but using these different forms, mediums of expression, are engaging with this discourse. So that is another part of this. Then there's a podcast section where scholars from different fields. Okay, now this is what I find interesting about migration. You can study it from history, political science, sociology, anthropology, geography, climate, every different discourses of humanities and social sciences you can relate to migration. And bringing all that together from different fields, scholars are coming and talking about how do they relate to sort of South Asian migration, and how does their work hold a pertinent sort of, value in current researches that are happening. Then there are narratives by people who are also artists and scholars but are living outside of South Asia, and what does it mean to sort of, for example, there's a series of narratives by artists who are from South Asia but not living in South Asia, and they're doing art in the white lands, what I call, I mean, within white people, white population, the West. And what does it mean to do art? And I'm saying this all in quotations. What does it mean to do art or practice art as people of color, as people who are themselves engaged with this discourse of migration but are migrants themselves as well? So there are different things that are happening within this entire exhibition, and the purpose is that somebody who's interested in migration, South Asian migration specifically, historical migration or contemporary migration, can sort of see how diverse it is to approach this topic, how diverse. And my goal is also to bring together primary and secondary material. So I have narratives by people, I have written narratives, oral narratives by migrant communities. I have narratives talking about discrimination, talking about, othering, alienation. And I also have sort of research materials and secondary material where a researcher can go to. So it's trying to make it as inclusive as possible, the platform, so that different people from different fields can sort of connect to it, associate it with, and contribute to it. So this is what the exhibition is about. And it's also part of a larger research and creative collaborative, Memory Movement Montage. I'm a convener of that collaborative. It's based in University of Minnesota, and the museum is scheduled to be launched on 15th of January 2023, and it will be available to everybody and anybody, especially if students are interested in it, students and researchers, current researchers. It can be accessed through the Memory Movement Montage website, and I will be sharing the www.memorymovementmontage.com, and I'll be sharing it somewhere. I hope you can share it somewhere in the podcast too, so that people can get access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll put it up in the show notes if any listeners want to, access it. And this is a permanent exhibition, right? So it doesn't matter when listeners go to it.
It's a permanent one also because every day something new is coming up. We have planned to sort of update it twice a year, add more materials, add more artwork, add more, if there are any other innovative we think that can be possible to have in addition to this, we will do that. So it's we update it every 6 months. That's the plan.
Also, I find the idea of oral histories fascinating, and I think they are the most powerful. How did you think of taking that route?
First, I'm somebody who's always been interested in stories, so that's my personal position. But moving away from that to a serious discussion of how oral narratives are really a huge part in understanding histories, oral histories, and alternative history, is, within partition studies, the primary focus has always been on the nationalistic narrative of the event, where the attempt is always to sort of construct a holistic history of the narrative of 47, like club everything together, the Western partition, the Eastern partition, looking at India as like pre-partition India as one large homogenized landmass and so on, so but the focus needs to shift to the grassroots levels. It has to come from bottom up rather than top down approach, and that is where oral narratives and orality and oral histories are so crucial. So it's a very recent phenomena. During the 1990s, actually late 1990s, is when alternative history sort of found a space in academics, and the focus was shifted to oral histories, and scholars began to record narratives of first generation partition migrants. And you have a lot of them, but even in this is another, the initial discussion that we have, there's a lack with the Eastern partition narratives that we have from the first generation compared to the second generation. There are a lot more books, a lot more publications of first generation narratives from the Western Front. So, the interesting part with orality is intergenerational trauma, which can only travel through oral narratives, memories, and nostalgia. So, these are fundamental to study any event where there has been a fracture in our history, there has been a fracture in understanding of who we are, where we come from. So partition, of course, being one of them, and thus oral narratives is very sort of dominant way of understanding how people perceived partition. Also, I'm studying what you said, home and sense of belonging. And home and sense of belonging are such fluid topics that it's almost impossible to study them through the larger mainstream nationalistic history of partition that we have. I think the only way we can just do any kind of justice to understanding how home and sense of belonging is and formation of identity is perceived within these migrant families is to study them through their oral histories. And also it's interesting and important to notice that these traumas or sense of loss, or these narratives also, they're not constant. Within the intergenerational transferences, they change, they transform into something else, they transgress into something else, and which is vital to understand how the perception of partition is changing from generation to generation, and also to understand why so for looking at all these different you know crucial yet complex understanding of partition, or complex lens to perceive partition, I found orality or oral narratives was the only way to go about it. The larger narratives sort of, it debunks the purpose of understanding the plurality of partition, and it puts them all together, which is, I don't think, is a very good reading of partition in some sense. Of course, it gives you the chronology, which is very great and which is very essential to understand history. But history is much more than that. History is much more than politics of the nation, or how political parties responded to it, or what decisions were made. It's also how it affected the people. So I'm looking at the latter part of that, people and their stories.
So tell us about your migration from India to Berlin. Why did that happen?
Where that happened. So my migration was first from Delhi to, so till my undergrads, I was in Delhi. I was a student of Delhi University, and with the majors in literature, English literature, and the minors in journalism. And after that, I don't know, we had amazing professors. Luckily, through our professors, we got to know about this program in IIT Gandhinagar, Gujarat, which also sort of, the program is called MA Society and Culture, and it gives you an arena of subjects and topics to choose from. And we had a course in partition, particularly there. And that is how I took up, like, I realized I can study partition academically. But the thing is, for doing a PhD, which I was very keen on doing, it's in India, you have the GRF system where you have to major in something, like you have to give the exam in either sociology or anthropology or something. And migration study is still not a very dominant discourse in India. Like, a lot of people are studying it, but reaching migration, what I said, through different other discourses, not migration studies as a discourse in itself. And so, because I come like in between. Like, in my master's, I studied fictional narratives of partition and how sort of women are represented, East Bengal narratives, and how women are represented in them. So, sort of a feminist reading of those. But so I was doing literature with migration. I was doing oral narratives with migration, and I was also looking at the larger academic sort of scholarship already available. So neither did I completely fit in literature, nor did I fit in history, because oral history is a part of history, but comparatively a very new form. And I did not fit in social science, as in political science or sociology completely either. I had a mix of everything. Also, I had a mix of psychology because I study how sort of, with the first generation, how children's psyche understand partition, and so on and so forth. So the things that I was focusing on were from all over and not one particular discipline as given in the PhD system in India. And luckily, I was applying to courses outside India where I did not have to restrict myself to one particular discipline, and rather I could study all of these things and do justice to them. I didn't have to sort of prioritize, okay, I'll sound more sort of history oriented just so that I fit into the history department. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to sort of compromise in that front. And luckily, I came across this program, Moves Migration and Modernity, Historical and Cultural Changes. So this program it's like an extension to how you have Erasmus Mundus program for the master's students. This is like a PhD program, and it's a 3 years program. You do not have other batches for this. This was a one-time released program by the EU, European Union. It was funded by the EU. There were 15 positions and so on and so forth. And I'm the only South Asian studying it there. So the program was based on any kind of migration that was due to the impact or effect of colonization, and 1947 partition being one of the largest migration that colonization imperial rule ever resulted into. I fit in the program. But most of my colleagues are from Europe or South America or America, and they're studying Africa or Europe outside EU or South America. So I think a lot of people here outside India are doing very amazing work because they're not limited within. I'm not saying people in India are not, but it's a system that sort of limits you to, focus on one particular discipline rather than having a more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary sort of methodology. My program thankfully allows me to do that, and that has actually helped me to, have a better grasp on my topic and sort of cover a larger perspectives than limiting myself. So that is how I traveled from India to Europe. And Europe was also, it was our orientation, 1 month orientation program was in Prague. Then in my program, it's a joint doctoral European doctorate, which means I'm associated with 2 different universities. So my first 1.5 years, I was in France, Montpellier, and the university was University Paul Valéry Montpellier. And the second half of my doctoral program is in Berlin with Freie University Berlin. So that is how I'm here. And also then I started working with State Library Berlin and started working for curating they have an entire section where they publish online exhibitions and online museums. And I started working for that. So that also helped me sort of tie my theoretical dissertation work with a more hands-on multimedia sort of forum where I could engage with more people. So that is like sort of my personal narrative. Also, I'm from Delhi. My parents are from West Bengal, but that's not my migration narrative. That's my parents. So I'm a second generation Bengali from West Bengal living in Delhi. So I think today everybody's a migrant, especially people in India. It's really hard to say where are you from exactly, where do you
Yeah, that's
live.
absolutely correct. Yeah.
So I think everybody has a very complex history today. So yeah.
So, Rituparna, that brings me to the question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
Well, that's a hard question to answer, but if I have to, I will go back to why do I relate to migration so much? Like, why is it such a personal thing for me? So I think migration is much more than a mere physical phenomena of moving from one place to another. It is part of your identity. It is how you describe yourself in relation to someone else, to another, and how you're also perceived by the other. So, it's a dynamic, fluid process, and it's very hard to sort of pinpoint migration at one particular point of time, at one particular point of place. So, for instance, like I just said, I'm a Bengali, but am I really? I mean, I grew up in Delhi. I was born in Delhi. I lived most of my life in Delhi. But even then, when I define myself, if I can, there will always exist a Bengaliness in me. and the way I see myself and the way I present myself. And I'm happy for that, the kind of food I eat or the language I grew up with. I'm happy with the kind of inputs it gives to me conceptualizing who I am as an individual. So migration is an unavoidable and rather an admirable reality of today's world. Nobody is anymore from one singular space or grows up with one singular ethnic or religious community. So there is like a regional or ethnic cosmopolitanism taking place where almost all of us are in constant dialogue with the other, and which is great, I think, to understand the other or all these larger concepts of diversity and integration that we are hearing everywhere. This is like the most catchy phrase that you have going on. Everybody's throwing it around, but I think it comes down to how you associate with these terms and how you yourself sort of view, how you place yourself or position yourself within this debate of diversity and integration. And you know when I talk about, especially for being from India, we all exist, we knew the existence of multiple religious practices, we are directly or indirectly part of it, we know about the various regional diversities that exist in India. And there's also, which is a good thing, like if you see it, so migration is a very negative term, I think, when it comes to the political discourse. Like, people don't want to associate themselves as a migrant identity with the migrant identity, but all of us are aspiring or willing to sort of move out of our comfort zones and go to different regions and visit South India for a North Indian, or visit North India for a South Indian, or Northeast India. You always want to visit and explore these different regions and try their different cuisines and try out their customs and things like that. So the moment we say migration, because it's so politically heavy word and it's so bureaucratic in its nature, sort of a given negative connotation is attached to it. And the moment you say, I just went there for traveling, or I'm going there for tourism, or even if you find a job somewhere nice and you're happy to go there, it's a very different story. And I think, as people, even though there might be a conscious resistance for acceptance of the other, we still aspire to explore the other in a positive sense. Like, you do get curious to know if there is a new, especially if it's an all Punjabi community, say in Delhi, and if there a South Indian comes in and the neighbor is curious to know about them, they want to taste their food. And also, as because it's so cosmopolitan today, you do like to go to a restaurant which does not belong from your regional or ethnic, culture. You do like to explore it. And I feel this is a world where escaping migration in some form or the other is close to impossible. It is impossible. And I think that is amazing when I talk about migration. And the way I talked about migration right now is not something that is very, full of jargon or very academic. It is a very commonsensical understanding of migration. And I think it is essential to look at migration this way as well, to understand the other complexities that lie in it. And this is why I work with migration. This is why I work with oral narratives. And this is why I work with people, like actual people, interview them, because I think it's their narratives and their stories and their histories that are later sort of put into the form of theories or larger academic scholarship. But it is them mostly who are living migration. So when it comes to the discourse of migration, I think people are very important to study, and people in a grassroots level are very important to study, where there's a diversity of caste, class, gender, religion, everything. And India is an amazing petri dish to study this, because you do have such intersectionalities. Everybody's has multiple identity traits, and that's great to study migration. And that is why I think personally I'm so motivated to work in this particular discourse.
Rituparna, home as the center of life is a basic human instinct. Being forced to leave it can impact generations, as you've shown. I wish you great luck in your exhibitions, and I look forward to seeing more of your research. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And it was really amazing talking about my project. It's mainly written work that I do. So talking about it, especially after COVID, when the conferences are limited in number, it's really nice sharing it with you. Also, I would really like to request all the listeners to check out the museum, the virtual museum, once it's online. It's going to be launched on 15th of January on www.memorymovementmontage.com. And I hope they like it, and I hope there's something that they can associate to within that museum. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in, for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.